Welcome to Master Your Merger, the podcast for leaders navigating the people side of mergers and acquisitions. Each week, your host Clint Kendrick talks with deal makers, HR leaders, and integration experts to uncover what really works when it comes to people, culture, and performance during a deal. From retaining top talent to aligning leadership, you'll hear real stories and actionable insights from the people doing the work, all designed to help you make your merger work. If you're leading through M&A, this is your weekly playbook.
Hello and welcome to Master Your Merger. Today's guest is Dr. David Schweiger, a true pioneer in the field of M&A integration. Dave has consulted with executives of numerous public and private companies, helping them successfully navigate both domestic and international mergers and acquisitions. He was among the first to systematically study how integration impacts deal success and long-term financial performance. Insights he captured in his influential book, M&A Integration, a practical framework for executives and managers, published by McGraw-Hill. He's also a distinguished professor emeritus of management and international business at the Darla Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. Dave, I'm thrilled to have you here today.
Thanks. It's great to be with you. I appreciate having the time.
I really appreciate how willing you are to share your experience with our audience. So why don't we kick off and you can tell us a bit about your journey. How did you come to focus your career on M&A integration?
Life is full of accidents. This was probably one of them. Make a long story short, I started my career out, I was trained as an engineer and didn't really like doing that. So I went back to graduate school and found out that I really enjoyed engineering, but I also enjoyed more the people side of things. So I went off and studied social science and basically went back to business school, University of Maryland, got my PhD in business and corporate strategy. And I was young, doing my research, like everybody else, trying to find a direction to go in. Well, one thing that really grabbed me all along the way is that when I was working as an engineer, I always noticed that it was light on people and heavy on technology. And I always wondered, what about these people? We've got to implement things. We got to be committed. We got to drive. It doesn't get done. Maybe AI will replace us. That remains to be seen. So anyway, I decided I wanted to put these two things together, the technical side of the world. And I'm talking about technology broadly. That can include finance and it can manufacturing, whatever. And so when I got my doctorate, I got in corporate strategy, but I also took a minor in the psych department. And when I got out and started working with corporations early on, I noticed they were very good at making decisions and not so as good at implementing decisions. And that became the area or the arena that I wanted to get involved in, the behavioral side, but linking it with the business side. And how do we make strategic decisions? But more importantly, how do we implement them? How do we drive them into the organization? And as from your experience, you're a seasoned executive, it's not easy to do. It's one of the most difficult things, and you can have the grand strategy, the grand plan, but if you can't put it into action, it's been a nice experience, and then that's it. Now everyone's scrambling and fighting. So that's in a nutshell how I gravitated there. And back in the 80s, in particular, the big focus in M&As was on deal making. And also during the 80s was when all these corporations were going through restructuring. IBM, they were downsizing. It was the first time that they didn't have lifetime employment because we were starting to deal with the Japanese, and now we're dealing with the Chinese and South Korea and so on and so forth. And these countries have gotten much better at implementation and also getting more creative in doing business. So these deals were going through, but were they creating value at the end of the day for shareholders or for privately held company, its owners? That was another story. And investment bankers, they're incentivized to get a deal done. And after that, it's not that important to them. It's not within their bandwidth, their skill set, or their interest or incentive systems. So that's the path that I basically took. I wanted to do applied things that helped organizations execute on all these things that they were trying to do.
When I talk with folks about why it matters to do M&A, I keep coming back to the HBR statistic of 70 to 90% of deals fail to meet their deal thesis, right? They don't maintain the value. And in fact, some destroy value. And that number goes back to the 80s. I think I've seen some research as far back as the 70s that shows that. And that number hasn't really moved a lot in the intervening few years. So why do you think that is?
I mean, that's a good question. When I was running my consulting business, and still when I advise, I always have three elements that I look through three different lenses. One is, what are the functional challenges, like integrating systems and maybe changing manufacturing processes, whatever. And especially in M&As, there's a lot of room for change. It was a necessary but not sufficient condition for success. So what I learned and integrated was the organizational culture played a big part. It's how people did things. It's how people got results. And in some cases, we're very successful at that. And then the other one, which we talk about culture, but we don't talk about politics. The internal politics in organizations, whether they're going through change or merging, I mean, let's be honest, we are hardwired for survival as human beings. It's a fact. The evolutionary biologists know that. We will morph to survive. And so you got to look through who's going to win, who's going to lose, who do you need to have on the team, who do you don't care. All these things start to play. So I use all three of these lenses when I'm doing almost any implementation, but especially in mergers and acquisitions, when you're trying to bring two organizations or parts of organizations together.
Right.
So that to me was what became critical. But to your question, why, I think organizations are really light on the cultural side. It's a very hard thing to grasp. It's a hard thing to measure. In many cases, some of the executives I dealt with said, that's the HR problems. Let's get the deal done, and then we'll worry about that later. And the problem is, in many cases, it never entered into the due diligence process. It was always after the fact, only to find out that we're not going to get the results that we were looking for in this deal for a variety of reasons that we can explore, if you like.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. I remember when I was first starting my journey in M&A, I had an executive look at me and say, when you can pour me a cup of culture, I'll care about it. Yeah. And I thought that was really telling. And then about a year later, we sold that acquisition. Because it wasn't absolutely at a loss. I often joke that in our field, there is a common joke that it's okay, you bought it. If it doesn't work, you get to sell it too. So
congratulations.
It's job stability, right?
Yeah.
So we continue to underestimate the cultural side of integrations, and you were clearly one of the first to explore that. What are some of the ways that you can practically assess cultural compatibility during diligence or even during the early deal phases?
During due diligence is really tough because there are regulatory restrictions, especially if you're buying up a competitor, on what you can talk about, what constitutes collusion. So it's a rough area to work yourself around. Certainly discussions of pricing and products and things like that are limited. What we do, what I've recommended and what I've actually done is a couple things. You get information where you can get it. So for example, everybody has used some kind of cultural survey instrument. We have our own, we've used it. But at that stage, very few executives are going to give you access to their organization that tapping in. Sometimes executives don't want anyone to know anything's going on. Good news or bad news, we can debate that. But so observe. Let executives observe the leadership teams, talk to people, observe how they work, how they do things. I've had several situations like that before the deal was even done. Let me give you an example. I was working for a very large engineering, design and construction company in the US that was doing a lot, running for the DOE, Department of Energy, a lot of nuclear cleanup sites, and they were bidding for contracts. There was a big opportunity within the last several years in England, but to win the work, you had to be an English company in this case. So they wanted to go out and buy this English company to give them the footprint in the marketplace. We learned in the due diligence things like this large corporation has this massive capital investment process, like most people do, budgeting process and whatnot. And the other company This was a small company, very outstanding engineering company, but they did small projects. So now you have this large company who has a way of doing things. And this is big hundred millions to billions of dollar contracts with the Department of Energy. They couldn't get comfortable with these other guys. They didn't want to do big contracts. They were a small 100-person engineering firm, privately held. My client was a large publicly traded company. And so you can imagine the entrepreneurs and the bureaucrats, you could see it from the get-go, it was not going to work. And so they had to move on from that. The recommendations we made, you could try this deal, but all your assets, in this case, were people. If the engineers left, the firm really was not going to be a platform where you can just buy the business. These people had relationships into their British organizations or the equivalents of the DOE. So this is just some ways of doing it. Was we looked at how they did things, and some of it was a little bit of common sense to realize what are we going to dump the executives and make them work the way we do? It was not going to happen. All the assets are going to walk out the door if you applied that model and leave you with nothing.
Yeah. And so it sounds like they did pass on the deal.
Yeah.
No, that's great. I often hear where those warnings are sounded and then the company proceeds and it ends up often going the way that it's predicted. So I'm really glad they listened in that case.
Yeah, it wasn't easy. You have to make a case because in the deal making side, people get excited and they also get a lot of investment, time, energy, and you don't want to walk away from a deal if you don't have to, but you got to have that ability to say, okay, the price was good. It's just not going to work. And I'm being fairly simplistic in describing this, but it was observation, interviews with key people, and learning. And then making some judgment calls based on our experience. Is this going to fit or not? And maybe this was a little bit of an obvious and easy one to do in the first place.
Sure. Dave, you talked a little bit about this being a U.S. and a British company coming together. We often talk about organizational culture, but we don't often talk about national culture when we're doing things like cultural assessment. How do you think national culture or even regional cultures, like here in the U.S. doing business in the South versus the Northeast, can be really tricky? How do you look at those national or regional cultures when you're doing this process?
Yeah, there are different layers. National culture is a layer. And you could probably draw some general conclusions from that big picture. When you get down you say you're in the United States, to your point, you got the Northeast and the Southeast. And I could tell you, I was born in New York City and I went to college in New York City and I lived in Texas and worked there. And I've been in South Carolina since 1986, now down at the coast, which is a little bit more of a mix. But the differences are really critical. There's a critical nature to time. There's aggressiveness, conflict resolution, decision-making. You could see how they're different. And it's across culture, international cultures. It could be even more complicated than that, depending upon when we're dealing with a Western country, there's some similarities that we could build off some core values. When you're in Asia, or you're in the Middle East trying to do business, most seasoned executives would tell you there's a lot of learning. And we've got to be smart to realize that we're not going to always get our way and get the bounty. And so you got to have to learn how to deal with the differences. Can we bridge them? If we can't, you can't always bridge them, but then you have to decide how we're going to learn to live alongside them. Or maybe better yet, in a world of dreaming, maybe they do it better and we can learn something from them that creates this proverbial use of the term synergy in it. And I'd like to come back to that a little bit in a while, to the concept of synergy from a financial standpoint and how that affects the deal with culture and other things in there.
Yeah, I absolutely love to dive in. We talk about synergies quite a bit as we go through this. So for our deals, it's always fun to see them on the spreadsheet. And then to your point, then to operationalize and how do we achieve those becomes a really fun conversation.
Yeah.
So before we dive into synergies, though, you've got an engineering background. A lot of that has to do with hard and fast physical things.
Yep.
So how can leaders measure whether their cultural integration efforts are working?
I'd like to address that in light of the way we measure culture. Because let me just point, we talked about doing due diligence, but after the deal is done and you own them, so to speak, and someone once told me a merger is just a polite way to call an acquisition.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard that, obviously. Yep. But once, the deal is done, you have a different level of access to the organization than you did during due diligence. We know that. Not easy always to get honest answers. In addition to observing and interviewing and doing groups, talking with groups and such like that, there are some pretty good instruments out there that you can capture the viewpoints of employees in it. Now, let's get to your point of how do we track it. Most companies, especially big ones, small ones are a little different. Even some mid-market companies are not as sophisticated in this arena as you would think. But you got pretty good technology as well as knowledge of project management. And we know when you're doing one of these deals, you're going to run it through the project management grinder. You got to have an insert there for cultural issues and whether they're going to enable or disable you to capture the sources of value in the deal. And it's not always an all or none thing. There are companies, so for example, that when Disney bought Pixar, okay, Disney was a production company, Pixar was really a creative one. They had to learn to respect and perceive the acquired company's culture as something positive and not screw with them, or they would destroy the source of values. So you've got to track how the technical side of things are coming, but you also got to track a lot of HR metrics. Are we losing key people? What's the retention rate? What's the turnover? Are we capturing the synergies? We'll use the term. And in many of these cases, they're intangible. Are we capturing them? The easiest synergies to put on paper, we're even seeing this right now in our country. We're in the middle of a culture clash in the US, which we will not talk about, but everyone can imagine. It's easy to document cost. And oftentimes to get the numbers, sometimes these companies non-strategically just start cutting costs here and there where they think they can get the big bundles, but they may be cutting out some muscle as well. So cost synergies, whether they be fixed cost or variable costs, because you can have more market power negotiating with suppliers and even with distribution channels. But when we get to revenue now, and I'll give you another example, I worked with this company that sold kitchen equipment for industrial outlets. They were big. It was a highly fragmented industry that had a lot of small players like Frymaster. They made frying machines. Make a long story short, they bought up all of these small firms with the belief that one of the major sources of synergy would be cross-selling.
Okay.
And they could go to an integrative kitchen. The reality was all these small businesses had a different way of seeing things, and they weren't going to exactly play ball the same way. Second, they didn't want to cross-sell because they didn't want to give up control of their own customers in the situation because they didn't know the other folks, the other small businesses, or trust them. Make a long story short, all the great synergies of cross-selling and then an integrative product were a battle to get that. And again, people, this was controlling power and also a different culture in the way they got things done. There were a lot of meetings and a lot of agreeing, not agreeing. Sometimes you had to bring in an executive, replace an executive, just couldn't come on board, replace key people. But again, you had to be careful that we didn't lose institutional knowledge, that these people knew how everything worked, that not everything had been documented, especially in the small firms. So tracking HR variables, tracking culture, tracking employee morale, retention, especially in cases where people are critical to the success of a deal. And maybe if I'm buying up an upstream oil company, we've dealt with these kind of issues where basically what you want to get is access to properties, to reserves. People may be less relevant to you, but what you want to build a pipeline of, no pun intended, a pipeline of all of these different drilling sites that you can get your hands on.
Yeah, got it. think we're starting to look more and more around the intersection of culture and synergies. I saw a report by, oh, I'm going to get it wrong. It's either Bain or McKinsey, and I'd have to go dig it out. If I can find it, I'll link it into the show notes. But it talks about how firms that pay attention to culture actually do a better job at synergy capture. And we're starting to see some of those financial pieces being reinforced by the large firms. So obviously that's something that's been on your mind for several years.
Yep.
What do you think is the driver behind that? Why do you think it works when you pay attention to culture, or works better when you pay attention to culture?
It gets back to the deal-making side. If you'll forgive me to get off of the behavioral side to the financial side, because hopefully when you looked at my book, you noticed I tie it back to financial performance. I'm not a culture for culture's sake, but when you're doing a deal, you have to decide a valuation, and you have to be able to put a price around it. And usually some form of discount at the cash flow or asset pricing model is going to be the key here. And so what happens is there may be a market value. If they're publicly traded, it's easier. How many times earnings was the company worth? But when you're doing some of these internal return models, you're projecting revenues, costs, and it's like it's a forecast going on. If what the business is delivering to you right now is not worth what you're going to have to pay for it, now you got to get creative to justify doing the deal. And this is where you start to look into how can we improve either the business or our combined lot. So now when you start projecting synergies, these are cash flow values, to put it bluntly, because you have to enhance the cash flows to justify a higher price in the modeling. So maybe organizations are learning that. And if you look at a lot of deals today, they're not just manufacturing. You've got a lot in high-tech intellectual capital where all the assets walk out the door. So now preserving value by understanding the culture is number one. Now, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, you've got to retain what they bring to the table. Now, if you want to be creative together and advanced thinking, like I was talking about, even with the cross-selling or R&D or product development, people are going to have to work together to come up with new stuff. So the synergy models always show that we can afford to pay more just to get control of the company. But now, if you don't have the culture right and you premised your valuation on that, you got a problem if you can't deliver. And it isn't going to be just cutting costs across the board anymore. It's how you're going to be able to generate new revenue together, how you're going to be able to generate new products, how are you going to be able to maintain customers and keep customers satisfied, especially in service-based businesses. Otherwise, you're going to lose business.
Yeah, I remember talking with a colleague who is in professional services, and her comment was, look, the people are the product, right? So we have to keep them on board and keep them happy.
Exactly.
And it's, what did she say? She said they're not coin operated, right? So we can't just simply hand people retention dollars and expect this to work. We need to actually pay attention to why they're with this particular firm and what motivated them to use their skills there instead of going somewhere else.
Yeah. And getting back to the integration piece on this and the culture, when you're talking, you say we're going to merge the organizations, or you're going to acquire them and assimilate them. What we got to pay attention to in all of this, it's not an all or none deal where you don't want to take on organizational changes if you don't really need to or foresee that you're going to need to. Yeah, you're going to have to change to meet market changes, technology changes. This is going on. We're all living with this all the time now. The nature of work has changed, even though people coming back to work now, remote work, the generational changes in here are very important. So you want to go after where it matters, and maybe you just want to leave alone things that are working fine, or put them down the road when you get to understand the company a little bit better and you work with the people that are in the organization for a little longer. So all or none, you got to be careful. It's almost got to be more surgical where you decide that it's important to to extract that very specific value.
How do you go about doing that, Dave? Because one of the things that I've heard from a lot of folks is that large companies they are designed to operate at scale. Mid-sized companies are really attached to their ways of working, even if they could be a little bit more bespoke. And so they want to impose their will on the
Yes.
acquisitions. How do you do that surgical approach?
It takes, first of all, an enlightened senior management group. Okay. It takes engagement where if you come in and saying, okay, we bought you, we know what to do with you. Okay. You can impose your will on anybody.
Sure.
Let's see what kind of reaction you're going to get from key people. And again, it keeps coming back to key people. You need people with institutional knowledge. And maybe you're going to assign someone to a retention contract for 1 year to manage through the transition, but you already lost their heart.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, I work with a very large oil company. One on the West Coast acquired, I won't tell you, but you can guess. The other acquired one in White Plains, New York. And I knew the CEO of the one in White Plains, New York. And basically it was a takeover. Okay. And he knew he was gone. He was in a 1-year deal and he was going to walk out. But they really didn't care a whole lot in retaining a lot of people because they wanted assets. They wanted physical proven reserves and leases and things of that nature. So I think the executive team has to be very clear on what they want out of it and what they can get from it. And if it's not people, then, you run through the resistance. And we see companies doing that all the time. But when you run through the resistance in areas that you really need the expertise, I think you're in trouble. And then also what happens in those situations, a lot of people that may be staying on in the short term, you're going to lose them eventually because people are adaptive and the other said, I came to this company because I loved working this way. And it's not an easy task, to be honest with you, but you have to have the executive team to understand and buy into it. And sometimes it's just easier to rip out costs and to say, we're doing it our way.
Yeah.
The results have not been good.
Right. I keep coming back to that 70 to 90% number that's not moved a whole lot. I often say that culture is too important to leave to HR. And as an HR guy, I sometimes get funny looks when I say that, but I really believe that has to be driven by the top of the house. What role in your integration experience, what role did the HR people you were working with play in helping to shape and steward culture through that process?
Yeah. Let me reaffirm that I agree with you that HR should not lead. Leaders should lead the effort. Leaders should believe in the importance of culture rather than just saying it's HR's job. So if it wants to be taken seriously, it has to be led by the leaders of the organization. With that, and I think that's on anything major. You have to, and we know HR executives have to also be responsible to understand the business. For years, Dave Ulrich at University of Michigan and a bunch of others talked about, can an HR executive represent the functional area, but also be a business partner as part of the executive team where they understand the business? So that's a very critical element in addressing your question. What kind of HR leader is the person? Then with that said, you can coach, you can advise. If the executives say, look, I don't know anything about culture, but I think it's important. Can you explain it to me? Can you show me how we can do this? I think there's a role for HR. And in particular, you got a lot of people with PhDs trained in organizational development who know as much as you do. You're probably one of them. And in some cases, as much as I do about these topics. But they have got to step up, the leaders, to take responsibility. And among those things, it's how also we can talk about how they communicate with the organization and external stakeholders. To me, that is pivotal. I wouldn't do a survey asking people to rate communication in any company anymore. We already know the answer. Now, what we need to do is we need to fix the problem.
Right.
And executives have, rightly so, whether it be antitrust or worry about if you tell people the truth, they'll bolt. You can't manipulate people into staying in an organization unless it's a poor labor market and they're desperate. But right. I think HR brings a lot of the soul of the company to the table.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a partnership. But to your point, the leaders definitely need to lead. And I just can't restate that enough. It's always fascinating to me when it becomes an HR initiative. And when I look through the M&As that I've seen go really well, there has been a leader at the forefront who understands the culture on both sides
Yes.
and does a really good job of helping to thread that needle and bring the organizations together.
You're absolutely correct. And not only that, but when leaders own it, there seems to be a good budget available to do it right. And when leaders don't love it, that's the first place to go and cut.
No, it's funny. I talk to my students on occasion. I also adjunct teach. And I was talking with one the other day, and I'm like, if you want to know what's important to a company, look at where they spend their money.
Exactly. You got it.
So, and I think the same applies as we work through integration. I am constantly amazed at some of the soft stuff that makes a difference. Just corporate identity items, swag, right? So the t-shirts, the mouse pads, the stress balls, that kind of thing. And it just always amazes me when I'm like, we just spent $50 million buying this company, but I can't have $300 to hand people a stress ball. Come on.
Yeah. We're bridging out into organizations in general. And just some things that I've experienced, probably you have similar things. The companies, the 90s, the hot thing was getting a group of the executive team together and writing out their core values.
Okay.
And then they would print them on cards and then they'd put them on plaques.
Yep.
And if you're going to do that, I don't think it's necessary personally. If you've got to remind people what the values are, you're obviously not living them. I think it's behavior, and that starts with communication. Are you trustworthy as an executive? And that's on you. That's on you as the leader. If people can't believe the executive team, there's going to be suspicion all the time, and they're going to imagine the worst. And if they feel they're going to be manipulated, they're already upgrading their resumes and they're starting to look. And the people there's people who go out the door, and the ones that remain are watching how people go out the door.
Right.
And they're saying, what's happening to me when it's my turn? Can I trust these guys? And then they talk about we're family and all this stuff. Is your family going to fire you? Maybe yes, but you get the point.
I do. I had an executive once say, don't talk about us like a family because nobody ever laid off grandma.
Exactly. There you go. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. Babe, these are some really great tips. We're just running close on time here. Yeah. As we think about those really important lessons you've learned over decades of working in this space, if you could distill it down to just one or two tips that you would give people that could elevate their approach to integration, what would those one or two tips be?
I would say pay attention to the political side of things and to the cultural side of things. People matter. And especially today, when 70% of our economy is built on service-based organizations, it's a people business that we are heavily in. Intellectual talent, people with terrific ability to interact with customers. Don't ruin that and don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I'm coming at this, I should say, as a business school professor, or an ex-business school professor, but not as a psychologist. It's the numbers speak for themselves. If you don't believe the numbers, then, you're going to be a victim. So that's what I would say I would really pay attention to.
Definite words of wisdom. So Dave, before we wrap up, if listeners want to connect with you or learn more about your work, where should they go?
They can email me. I don't publicize myself anymore these days. I do things pretty behind the scenes with clients and things. So very simply, they can reach me at dschweiger123 @gmail.com. I guarantee you that if send me something, want to learn something, want me to send you an article or tell you where to go for things, whatever else, I'm more than happy to talk to you or email with you, however you like to communicate.
Oh, that's awesome. So very generous of you, Dave. And we'll also put a link to your LinkedIn in the show notes as well, in case people want to check you out there.
Yeah, that would be great. I appreciate that.
Dave, again, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts. And my goal is to see organizations continually do a better job at this, because they do a lot of growth through acquisitions. It's not an automatic outcome. Sometimes it might be better to home grow the business rather than to acquire it. But thank you. Appreciate your time. It was a lot of fun talking with you.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Master Your Merger, hosted by Clint Kendrick. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found this valuable, share it with someone leading through a deal. To explore toolkits, resources, and upcoming programs, including our free roundtables, visit masteryourmerger.com. We'll see you next time.